if we can get started. Thank you. Yeah, I'll just begin the proceedings if everyone's ready. Excellent. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, and everyone joining today for the workshop. My name is Patrick Martin, and I will be your MC for today's event. ESCAP and PIPS co-host this event, and as such, we will begin with opening remarks from Mr. Kaveh Zahidi, Deputy Executive Secretary of ESCAP, and Dr. Philemon Manoni, Deputy Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. We will begin with Mr. Kaveh Zahidi's opening remarks. Kaveh, you have the floor. Thank you.
Patrick, thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome from Bangkok to all of you joining our workshop on debt for climate swaps, organized jointly by UN ESCAP and the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat. Of course, first and foremost, I would like to thank the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat for the partnership and collaboration, and very much also look forward to hearing the video message from Dr. Philemon, the Deputy Secretary General, shortly. Now, this workshop is in a way a pre-event for the Pacific Regional Debt Conference that ESCAP and the Pacific Islands Forum are organizing between the 5th and 8th of April of this year. Allow me to say a word or two about our event today and to some degree our expectations. From the perspective of ESCAP, the issue of debt for climate swaps in a way goes to the very heart of building back better and building back fairer. The COVID-19 pandemic, we all know, caused a great deal of damage in terms of lives and livelihoods, but it also has had a profound effect and a negative financial implications for developing countries of our region, both short and long term. We know that many developing economies in Asia and the Pacific are experiencing shrinking fiscal space and rising debt levels at the very time where higher investments are desperately needed in health, in education, in connectivity, in social protection, and so on, in order to help people in the recovery from COVID-19. The Pacific Island developing states have been especially hard. So the Pacific Island developing states have been especially hard hit because of the collapse of the tourism and travel industry that's caused GDP growth to fall and of course fiscal deficits to rise. As a result, public debts as a share of GDP have also risen in most of the Pacific Island states. What is more, Pacific Island states have continued to suffer from the increasing frequency and severity of weather events linked to a changing climate. We have seen, in a way, converging and cascading risks that are undermining not only response and recovery from the COVID pandemic, but also the likelihood of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And the Pacific, of course, is acutely aware of the climate emergency. As a result, I think policymakers are faced with a multifaceted challenge, a challenge that includes ensuring a sustained and inclusive socioeconomic recovery, that includes financing the rising fiscal deficits and tackling debt sustainability, and of course, the challenge of building resilience to confront the region's vulnerability to the changing climate. So on the surface, debt for climate swaps could certainly be one answer to this multidimensional challenge. They are an innovative financing instrument that can help to both reduce debt burdens and allocate some much needed additional financing for climate action projects. The idea is not new. The idea of debt for climate swaps is not so far away from and maybe had its roots in the debt for nature swaps that we have seen before, where they've been implemented since probably the late 1980s in various indebted developing countries. And I think this enables us to learn from some of the obstacles that existed for such swaps, and maybe obstacles that prevented those swaps really going up to the level and scale of the potential. Now, while debt for nature swaps have been useful, they have been at times criticized for the high monitoring, the transaction costs, and as I say, never probably reached their full potential in terms of scale. We tend to hear more or less the same examples over and over again, and they haven't ballooned in the way we would have hoped. So an important issue to discuss in this workshop is how to reduce maybe some of these transaction costs in debt for climate swaps and really be able to go to scale. Now, debt for climate swaps can potentially contribute probably to two very key elements of the Paris Agreement on climate change. So in our workshop, we are going to try to unpack some of these and address some of the key questions, including, for example, can debt for climate swaps help developing countries finance their nationally determined contributions or NDCs, especially the conditional NDCs, which depend on the availability of financing for implementation. At the same time, can debt for climate swaps provide a way for developed countries to meet some of their climate finance commitments by providing funding to NDCs while at the same time reducing debt levels? These are some of the questions that I think go to the heart of our conversation today. Debt for climate swaps, and I'll finish here, are certainly a promising and innovative finance mechanism, especially for Pacific Island states. And because of that, we really are very much looking forward to learning from all the various presentations that have been lined up today and from discussing with all of you on whether and how they could become a reality in helping spur greater climate action. So I wish us all a really successful and certainly fascinating workshop. Back to you, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Kaveh, and thank you for getting us started. And just as Kaveh said, if everyone could please keep their microphones on mute so as not to get the feedback going forward. Unfortunately, our next opening remarks were to come from Dr. Philemon. Unfortunately, Dr. Philemon cannot deliver his opening remarks today in person due to another engagement, but he has prepared the following recorded message. If we could now play the recorded message, please.
Bula Vinaka and greetings to all of you from the Blue Pacific. First of all, on behalf of the Pacific Island Forum Secretary General, I would like to thank my colleagues from the Secretariat and you and ESCAP for organizing this very important event. I am pleased to accept the invitation to offer a few remarks at this workshop. The Pacific Island countries are no doubt on the front line of climate vulnerability. Pacific leaders have identified climate change as the greatest threat facing our region. For us, it is an existential threat. This was confirmed by the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that was released at the end of last month. Sadly, time is not on our side. If urgent actions to deal with the increasing climate and disaster risks are not undertaken immediately. Our region is highly exposed to disasters such as tropical cyclones, earthquakes, tsunamis, and droughts. Several of our forum members are amongst the most vulnerable countries on the planet. The recent massive volcanic eruption and tsunami in Tonga, for example, wiped out 18.5% of Tonga's GDP. The country needs at least $240 million to fully recover from the disaster. And this at the time when it is still recovering from the impacts of Cyclone Harold that struck 2 years ago. It takes many years and huge cost for Pacific economies to recover from the socio-economic losses resulting from these disasters. In addition, many countries find themselves borrowing heavily to rebuild after every disaster, and it is common in the region that a new disaster strikes when countries are still recovering from the previous one. Countries are therefore easily trapped in this never-ending borrowing, rebuilding, and borrowing cycle. As a result, debts of Pacific countries continue to mount, placing immense fiscal pressure on governments, on communities, and families, perpetuating poverty, inequality, and hardship. According to the sustainability assessments of both the IMF and the World Bank, 13 Pacific economies have been assessed at high risk of debt distress in 2021. This is up from 6 countries in 2019. This is therefore a cause for concern going forward, as high debt levels mean less resources for other priority needs such as health and education. The region therefore needs innovative financing instruments to address our debt situation and build resilience against climate risks. That is why this workshop on debt for climate swaps and the upcoming Pacific Regional Debt Conference, which is planned for next month, are so important. They provide a critical platform to allow us to explore options to address the challenges posed by high debt profiles and climate vulnerabilities facing many Pacific economies. I also note with great interest the inclusion of the Pacific Resilience Facility on the agenda for discussion during this workshop. The PRF is a very important initiative for the Pacific, and the Secretariat will continue to consult and advocate with our development partners for their support and financial commitment in order to capitalize the facility. The potential to use the PRF as a vehicle to implement debt for climate swap arrangements is acknowledged in the ESCAP report on debt for climate swaps. And I would urge that we explore this option further going forward. I would also like to take this opportunity to call on the region's development partners to support the PRF, because this is our beacon of hope and for many Pacific peoples. The use of the PRF to address the region's debt situation and at the same time build community resilience against disasters can be a win-win option for all of us in the Blue Pacific. Finally, let me wish you all a very fruitful discussion on this very important matter. And indeed, the Forum Secretariat looks forward to the outcomes of this workshop, and most especially the next steps in realizing the potential benefits of debt for climate swaps for economies in our Blue Pacific continent. And I thank you.
Excellent. Well, that was a great start and much appreciated the opening comments from Kaveh and Dr. Philemon. We'll now move to the next part of the workshop, and today we'll be hearing from some very eminent speakers. Taken together, our speakers encompass an extensive range of experiences and depth of expertise from across the region and internationally. We're incredibly fortunate to have this wealth of knowledge here today. Today's speakers will include ESCAP's own Mr. Alberto Isgat. Alberto is the acting section chief of the Financing for Development section of ESCAP, where he is responsible for innovative finance and digital financing. Alberto has a wealth of experience and has been the lead author on a number of ESCAP flagship publications. Next, we have Mr. Slav Gachev, Managing Director, Sustainable Debt at the Nature Conservancy. Slav has decades of experience and recently led the team that helped Belize refinance over $500 million worth of external commercial debt to unlock funding for conservation. He will be sharing his insights on the Belize Debt for Nature swap and what that could mean for the Pacific. Next, we will have Mr. Eric Gigorvan. Eric is a senior advisor and negotiator for Armenia's debt for climate swap. Eric is also a former Minister of the Environment for the Republic of Armenia and was the lead author of the feasibility study on debt for climate swaps in the Pacific. Eric will share his insights into the study and negotiating Armenia's debt for climate swap. Then we will hear from Mr. Garth Henderson. Garth is the Financial Secretary at the Ministry of Finance and Economic Management in the Cook Islands. Appointed in 2015, Garth is the Principal Financial and Economic Advisor to the Cook Island Government. Garth is also Chair of the Regional Technical Working Group, responsible for developing the Pacific Resilience Facility. And he will be sharing his views on how the Pacific Resilience Facility might help enable debt for climate swaps in the region. And finally, we will hear from Dr. Wanting Ziong. Dr. Wanting is a research fellow at the Institute of World Economics and Politics, and serves as the Deputy Director at the Center for Development Research in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And recently she was the lead author on the soon-to-be-released book, International Principles for Sovereign Debt Governance. Dr. Wanting will share with us her views from the point of view of a creditor country, in this case, China. So first, we will have each of our speakers give a short 10-minute presentation, and following the presentations, we will have a Q&A session with our speakers. And I invite everyone here, if you'd like to put forward your questions using the Teams. We've received some questions when people registered, and if anyone's got more questions, please go ahead and we'll try to get those, although obviously time's limited. So to start with, I'll start with Alberto will briefly outline today's topic and present the draft findings of the feasibility study conducted by ESCAP and PIFs on debt for climate swaps in the Pacific to set the scene for today's discussion. Alberto, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Let me quickly share. Can you see the presentation at the moment?
Yes, we can, Alberto.
Okay, yes. Thank you so much. Okay, well, thank you for the introduction, Patrick, and welcome everybody. I would like to very briefly give you some, some information about the paper we prepared for this workshop. The paper at the moment is available in the webpage, in the event webpage. You're welcome to download it. But this is a preliminary version. We are going to have the final version for the debt conference in a couple of weeks. So the main question we want to answer is the question of this workshop. Are the debt for climate swaps feasible in the Pacific? And what do debtors need to know? So I'd like to start by giving some basic information about debt for climate swaps, presenting some examples. And as I go along, I will try to answer this question. The first thing, which is important because there's a lot of misconceptions about debt for climate swaps, is that debt for climate swaps are not the same as debt forgiveness. There is sometimes, some fear about, debtor countries who try to engage in a debt for climate swaps because it looks like they are, trying to get a cancellation of their debt from their creditors. But this is not the case. The debt for climate swaps is an agreement between the debtor and a creditor, or a number of creditors, that is mutually beneficial. So it's something that both the debtor and the creditor are going to benefit. Number two, I would like to say that debt for climate swaps are more a mechanism for innovative financing than a mechanism for debt release, right? So how we compare climate swaps and debt restructuring? They are similar in some ways, but they're different in some other ways. So debt restructuring aims at enhancing fiscal space, releasing pressures on the exchange rate. So it's basically a macroeconomic objective. But debt for climate swaps can contribute to both goals, as we will see. But the fiscal space created is going to be earmarked for projects in climate change mitigation and adaptation. So it's a kind of more limited, it's not a fiscal space available for anything. is for a very particular purpose. And because of this peculiarity, the scale of the swaps are likely to be too small to be used as a, as a full debt restructuring mechanism. And having said that, this can be part of a debt restructuring deal. But I think that we should see this mechanism most as an innovative financing mechanism. That's a kind of macroeconomic mechanism when there are difficulties with debt payments. The basic mechanism is, and this is kind of a cartoon explanation, is between a creditor government and a debtor government. So the creditor government cancels a debt or part of a debt, and then the debtor government commits to use these savings to pay in local currency for some environmental project or to contribute to a particular fund that will invest in environmental projects. From the point of view of the creditor, this will count as ODA or as climate finance. In reality, the mechanisms actually employed are a little more complicated. So the third-party swap is a more common mechanism in which there is an intermediary between the creditor government and the debtor government, an NGO like Conservation International by the Nature Conservancy or WWF. And basically, you can see there are two legs to the transaction. On the left, you have a transaction between this NGO and the creditor government, by which the NGO will purchase the particular debt or part of a debt at a discount. This can be done if it is done with a bilateral creditor. It will be some negotiated discount. If it is done in the market, for example, for bondholders' debt, it will be at the secondary market price. And then the NGO will cancel the debt of the debtor government. Same as before, the debtor government will commit to use these savings to fund in local currency a national fund or environmental projects. So this is similar, but there is this new figure that is the intermediary, the international NGO typically. And also we are also introducing a national fund that will also take care of this implementation. Let's look at an example. A concrete example will give us a little more meat of how this actually works. This is an example from Seychelles. That was the debt for climate swaps in 2015. So the creditors were members of the Paris Club, were Belgium, France, and the UK. Germany was going to be part of the deal, but at the end they pull out. And basically, there is an intermediary, which is the Nature Conservancy, right? And also there are grant providers. So look at this. This example is a little more complex because there is a very important role of the trust fund, which is called ESCAP, which stands for Seychelles Conservation and Climate Adaptation Trust. So basically, this trust fund deals with the whole transaction. It receives a loan from the Nature Conservancy for $15.2 million, and then also grants from philanthropic provider for $5 million. With this money, they provide this money to the government, and the government will then negotiate a cancellation of the debt with a small discount in this case. In this case, the discount is only 6.5%. So then the government, with these savings, future savings, because the debt services are going to be less, contributes back to the trust fund. And the trust fund has to repay the debt with the Nature Conservancy, and then commits to invest in program activities for $280,000 in local equivalent in local currency per year, and also $150,000 a year to capitalize an endowment. And this commitment is for 20 years. That is a good horizon to provide enough certainty for the activities that are going to be implemented. Now, what is very important in these schemes is the governance structure of the trust fund. So in this case, we have in the board, we have the Nature Conservancy, we have local NGOs, industry associations, and selected ministries. So this is a very important point, and I think it should be discuss a little more in this workshop because it's one of the key elements of a debt for climate swap deal. Now, some of the features that we can gather from this example, some of the questions that the debtors need to ask when they are planning this type of deal is first, which are the creditors, with which creditors debt is desired to be swapped. Second, very important point is who will provide the financing for the swap, right? We saw in the case of Seychelles, it was partly a loan by the Nature Conservancy, partly philanthropic grant. So what would be the mix of loans and grants? And what would be the conditions of the loans? All these details are very important, to see how feasible is the deal from the debtor's perspective. Also, what is the discount rate on the face value of the debt? So these are a lot of financial elements that need to be taken care of and need to be very clear when a deal is going to be prepared. Now, the next question is how much will the government contribute in local currency for climate projects? We can also add for how long, for how many years. We can add whether there will be some contribution to an endowment to create more funding into the future. So these are all questions that also need to be considered. And the most important is perhaps what entity will manage the funds and the projects, and what will be its government structure. We saw in the case of Seychelles is the ESCAP. And finally, not least, because this is the essence of the debt for climate swaps, what projects are going to be financed through the swap, right? This also needs to be clear. It cannot just be a purely financial transaction, but this financial transaction is going to support projects, concrete projects. Let's look at another example that will provide even more flexibility to this debt for climate swap. This is a proposal by the Commonwealth. And you can see the references in the paper if you are interested in learning more. So here we have one important issue is that normally multilateral development banks, who are sometimes important creditors to developing countries, do not provide a write-off of their debt, because of statutory reasons, they cannot do that. So the question is how, if you have a debt with multilateral development banks, how can you engage them in a debt for climate swaps? Well, the way to do this is to engage climate finance providers. So these can be governments, can be donors who are interested in contributing climate finance. And we are going to talk a little more in the next slide. So the thing is that these donors are going to pay back or pay part of a debt of a multilateral development bank for the debtor country to be able to come with some funding for the swap. So this is a very flexible way of looking at the problem, because these donors can also pay back part of a loan with a bilateral creditor or with commercial debt. So it's very flexible, I think, in this way. And also, this is important for many donor countries. The money doesn't need to be paid upfront. It can be done gradually. The debt can be written off, or some portion of a debt, over 10 years or more. So that provides more flexibility and makes it more feasible for donor countries to engage in this type of transactions. So to me, this is a very efficient way to channel climate finance. As you know, there's a commitment in the Paris Agreement of developed countries, or so-called Annex II countries under the UNFCCC, to provide $100 billion per year on climate finance to developing countries. This commitment was supposed to be reached by 2021, by 2020, actually, by the original schedule for the COP26, but that didn't happen. Now the estimation is that it will happen in 2023. But basically, these debt for climate swaps can be a way to channel this climate finance, right? And how this can happen. So if there are these developed countries, Annex II countries who are creditors, they can engage directly in a debt for climate swap deal with a developing country debtors. But they can also do the same as donors. They can also partially pay off a debt of a developing country with a multilateral development bank or a bilateral donor. So I think this opens a lot of good opportunities for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, in particular for the climate finance, which is an area that still needs to be implemented. Of course, in all these cases, the debtor has to fulfill a commitment to invest the savings in climate projects. Let's look a little bit at the situation of the Pacific. This is the composition of the public and publicly guaranteed external debt in selected Pacific small island developing states. There are only 6 of them in the World Bank International Debt Statistics. But as you can see, the majority of the debt is owed to basically to bilateral creditors and to multilateral development banks, right? Only in the case of Papua New Guinea, and this is data for 2020, there is some debt with private creditors. Fiji used to have before debt with private creditors as well, but it was paid off, at least by 2020. If you look at the bilateral public and publicly guaranteed external debt, you can see that China is the most important creditor. Japan has some participation in some countries, and also Australia and India. Also Australia, India, and Republic of Korea. But China is a very important player in the Pacific. These are the Annex II parties to the UNFCCC. You can see that only Australia and Japan are actually creditors and are also Annex II parties. So these both Australia and Japan could actually engage directly with developing countries in the Pacific for a debt for climate swap deal. But it is also possible for other members of the Annex II to engage in a debt for climate swap deal by, as I said before, as in the Commonwealth proposal, right? By contributing directly to paying off part of a debt with other creditors. It could be with China, it could be with a multilateral development bank. Now, the trust fund plays a really, really critical role in all this, because basically donors are not going to be, engaged in this kind of deal if they cannot have guarantees that the money will be managed effectively and that they will be implemented. The project will be also implemented in an effective manner. So this is a very, very crucial element in all, debt for climate swap deal. The story of debt for climate swaps is relatively new. In the past, there were debt for nature swap, and there was a learning process. There were some not so good experience with these trust funds at the beginning. So this is a process that has been improved over time. And I think that there is now consensus that this is a fundamental element of a debt for climate swap deal. Now, there are 2 critiques for debt for climate swaps. It used to be also a critique for debt for nature swaps. One is the small scale and the high overhead cost, right? So if you have a small country, even if the country is small, it's possible not to implement this process and have projects to be financed by debt for climate swaps. But if the country is very small, there will be a lot of overheads, for monitoring, for reporting, for financial management, and these overheads are going to make it very expensive, right? Another critique is, small countries, they have very good and competent people, but some of these countries are very small. So they don't have so many specialized financial people with financial and technical expertise. So this could also be a problem capacities. And these criticisms are likely to be accurate in small economies from the Pacific seas. But there are, for every problem, there is always a solution. One possibility that was also hinted by ESG Filimoni is that there can be economies of scale to be gained through a regional institution that can manage the funds and ensure the effective implementation of projects. And the Pacific Resilience Facility is already planned and is in the process of being implemented. And this fund will have these capacities to manage for financial management of the funds and also for project monitoring, review, and verification. So these are part of the important financial and technical elements that the PRS is going to have when it is fully implemented. So why not taking advantage of these services for countries in the Pacific that want to implement a default climate swap? Because the capabilities are going to be there and are going to be shared with all the Pacific countries. So this could be, I think, something to consider. It could be good for the countries who want to implement default climate swaps in the Pacific, but it's also good for the PRS because it will allow the PRS to gain additional experience and expertise in managing these, the financial and technical aspects of climate projects. So I think, in my view, it's win-win, but I may be wrong, and I would like to hear from the audience. Okay, so summing up, I think that a good scheme is the one proposed by the Commonwealth, where we are replacing the trust fund with the Pacific Resilience Facility. This could be a useful scheme for the Pacific states. And let me finish with some final considerations. First of all, I haven't emphasized this really, but this is extremely important. To consider a debt for climate swap, it is critical to start with a suitable pipeline of climate projects. So this project has to be prepared, it has to be there because it will be part of the negotiation. When a country goes to talk to donors, to talk to creditors, they also need to tell them, well, these are the projects we want. These are critical projects from our country because they need to make, to sell the case, to make the point that this is very important. And for that purpose, details on the projects are very important. Second, the projects should be aligned with the country's NDCs or other national planning documents. So these projects have to be owned by the country, are projects of national interest, and this is also a very important consideration. Number three is that when it comes to implementing projects, climate projects, you have mitigation projects and adaptation projects. For mitigation, it is more easy to find private creditors who will be willing to fund those projects in about solar or wind energy, because these are profitable projects. And then there will be a rate of return, and it will be attractive for private creditors. But when it comes to adaptation projects, this is more of the nature of a public good. You try to protect a country from damages, from climate events. So it's more difficult to find private creditors interested in financing adaptation projects. So therefore, climate swaps, because they can be partly funded by grants, and there can also be savings from debts that can be used. So it could be probably a good idea to consider adaptation projects, which is also, by the way, is the main purpose of the PRF. Now, some people might say, well, but the PRF is still not implemented. No, they still need to be funded, needs to be staffed. So what if a country wants to start implementing or negotiating a debt for climate swap deal? Do they need to wait maybe another 1-2 years until the PRF is up and running? It is not necessary to do that. There are many possible alternative institutional arrangements with a development partner, with an international NGO, with a private entity. So it is not necessary to wait, and the expertise can be gained by starting with some pilots in debt for climate swaps. So I finish here. I hope I didn't speak too much. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Alberto. Okay, now I'd like to invite Slav to deliver his presentation. Slav, you have the floor.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm happy to be here, and already in chat there was a lively debate with Cedric Raymond, who has some very good questions about the use of taxonomies and the use of named bonds, such as green and blue bonds for this type of endeavors, and we debated some of the limitations of the current taxonomies. And so you can refer to that chat, and I can talk about some more about that in my presentation. But what I'd like to do is walk you through another TNC more recent example to follow in the footsteps of Seychelles, and that is the blue bond that we recently placed in Belize or for Belize, and that was in November of last year. And so that example hopefully will show the evolution of our thinking following the Seychelles, which was a pilot case and a relatively small transaction. If you remember the presentation from Alberto, he talked about overall the conservation savings or the conservation flows unlocked by the Seychelles example to be in the $3 million overall, right? Split in chunks over a 20-year period. Whereas in the case of Belize, we actually have conservation savings of $4 million per year, right? And so in addition to a pre-funded endowment, so overall, you know, we unlocked $180 million for conservation by refinancing their existing loan, their existing super bond. Let me see if I can pull up my presentation and then I'll walk you through some of this. Can you guys see this okay? Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So I appreciated the shout out from Alberto with respect to TNC. Indeed, we are proud to be pioneers in this space basically marrying conservation programming with impact financing. And we have presence worldwide, and we are proud to be present in your region as well. Some of the islands where we have programming include Palau, Micronesia, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands, Marshall Islands, PNG, and Solomon Islands. And so when you look at the 72 countries on this slide, that includes a lot of the small island developing states in your region. So I'm not going to dwell so much on the basic structure of debt for nature swaps or debt conversions, TNC style, because Alberto did a very good job explaining that. Just perhaps to add a couple of more details as to how we think about, for example, marine or ocean protections. And we think about those with respect to allowing countries to achieve their 30% goals, their 30% protection goals. We all are familiar with the 30 by 30 by 3 global initiative for protecting lands and seas. And so, you know, our blue bond strategy is aligned with that. We're not trying to force anyone to do anything that they don't want to do. Rather, we work in a stakeholder-driven approach. We work with our partner governments to be able to create this fiscal space for them to invest in their own oceans. And even though I'm talking a lot about area-based protections, you know, as the previous speakers described, and as it's the point of this seminar, you can have similar conservation programming and commitments with respect to climate. Indeed, you know, at TNC, we look at climate from a nature-based lens. And the ocean, as we all know, is a very efficient carbon sink. And there are ways through, for example, mangrove restoration, coral preservation, etc., to achieve, you know, multiple goals, you know, to achieve biodiversity goals and also climate adaptation and mitigation. And so indeed, this model can be adapted to include both biodiversity and climate objectives in one neat package. So we like using conservation funds as the implementing entity for some of these projects. So the way it works is that the savings from the transaction get channeled into an independent conservation fund, which, you know, is not controlled by anyone. It has a separate board with representation from both government, civil society, NGOs, etc. And it is the conservation fund that receives most of the savings from the transaction and then on-lends them or on-invest them rather in the form of grants towards eligible conservation and indeed climate projects. With that, let me spend some time to walk you through the details of the Belize transaction. And so we, even though the Belize transaction was described as a blue bond because that's TNC's way of talking about our kind of the combination of financing and conservation programming for the ocean. It wasn't a named bond, and in the chat I made some of my points as to why the current taxonomies actually make it difficult to raise new blue or green bonds towards refinancing or debt conversion. So I know in your region, for example, Fiji is thinking of doing a new blue bond, but that would be a use of proceeds bond of $50 million. And so we're trying to come up with our own innovations to fit the current standards and some of the limitations in the current standards. And so, as I mentioned in chat, we're working elsewhere in the Caribbean, and we may actually try to structure a sustainability-linked bond, which I think lends itself better for these types of structures, as you're not so much obsessing over what the money will be spent for. I mean, it would be spent for refinancing pre-existing general purpose government debt that was accrued over years and decades. And so the actual spend may not be tracked, but rather what's important are the KPIs, right? The KPIs that the governments will commit towards, for example, their nationally determined contributions and other such KPIs. And if governments fail to live up to those commitments, then they would have to make incremental payments into the conservation fund on top of the base payments resulting from the transaction. And we think that that's a much better structure than additional funding going to foreign bondholders, which would make for a very perverse and paradoxical outcome, if you will, of foreign bondholders getting more money when things don't go as well. So anyway, some of these salient features were present in the Belize transaction, to the point of Alberto of some of the criticism that gets levied for debt conversions or debt for nature swaps about their small scale. Well, this wasn't small by any stretch of the imagination. This was the largest financing for ocean conservation in the world. We pulled over $500 million of an existing Eurobond that Belize had accrued over time. There were several restructurings of that Eurobond or Superbond, as they were calling it, until it ended up being what it was at the time of our intervention. And it was trading at relatively low rates. It was trading at 45, 50 cents on the dollar. And so what we did is we worked with Credit Suisse to raise a new facility, to structure a new facility, and basically provide it to the government. It's almost like a homeowner who is, looking to refinance their house. We were the pre-committed, pre-approved money that was standing behind the government in their restructuring discussions with the bondholder committee. And so what the government did is they basically made a cash offer to the bondholders at 55 cents on the dollar. And that was overwhelmingly approved by the bondholder committee, in part because it was a fair offer given the observed market prices for the debt, but also because the bondholders knew that the government is committing to conservation and climate goals, and that gave them enough of a cover, so to speak, to quickly agree to the proposal. And so when you then look at the use of proceeds, the new loan of $364 million, most of it, $301 million, was used to retire the Superbond. In our structure, we as TNC did not purchase the bond, but rather we provided financing for the government to repurchase the bond. But it had the same effect because the pre-existing bond was retired and the new much longer and much cheaper facility was provided to Belize. So the next slide presents quickly I will present quickly visually the structure of the transaction. So it's a back-to-back loan effectively. So our vehicle, BAC, was the market-facing entity. It entered into an arrangement with Credit Suisse, which placed the so-called blue bond into the market, and then lent the proceeds to our vehicle BAC, which then on-lent them to Belize in the form of a blue loan. So that was one important pillar of the transaction. The other important pillar of the transaction was the CFA, the Conservation Funding Agreement. And the Conservation Funding Agreement is that instrument which committed the government to funding the $4 million per year into the conservation fund, and also pre-funding an endowment that goes into the conservation fund, which will grow over time. One absolutely crucial aspect of this transaction was the presence of DFC, which is the Development Finance Agency of the US government, formerly known as OPEC. DFC provided a special instrument, a special type of political risk insurance, which we basically repurposed as a de facto credit guarantee to remove some of the political risk and repayment risk from Belize with respect to the new loan, and that allowed us to go to Moody's and get a AA rating on the new facility, compared to the selective default rating that Belize had at the time of our involvement. And so, as a result of everything that we did, we're generating $180 million towards conservation projects, also climate projects, over a 20-year period. That's the $4 million per year that I mentioned, and the $92 million of endowment, which will grow over time to be $92 million given the pre-funded level. And so we at TNC will help manage the endowment, which will allow then the conservation fund to continue its grant-making program beyond the 20-year horizon of the transaction for the long term, if you will. And so this was one of those rare situations where the government could have its cake and eat it too, in the sense that not only did it realize debt savings, right, net debt savings, both in terms of debt stock and cash flow savings, but also could fund conservation and climate projects in the country. So it achieved that twin. It's that Goldilocks scenario where you, as Alberto mentioned, where you can actually have those twin goals. I'm not kidding myself that in other scenarios we may not be able to, have net debt reduction on top of conservation fundings. Maybe we will just have conservation funding at no net debt increase to the government, and that is fine. That is, after all, the classic case for a debt conversion. And that would be a situation where a government is paying a relatively high interest rate, relatively high coupon, but the debt is trading, or in any case, the debt is trading at par, or in any case, it's not available for refinancing at a steep discount. And so therefore, basically, you're replacing high coupon, perhaps shorter term debt with longer term, lower coupon debt, and the savings then get channeled towards climate and other objectives. And you see some of the other salient features of this deal here, including parametric insurance, and then what happened at the end, which is that the country itself, their credit rating was raised to B- as a result of our transaction. Again, as a reminder, the financing itself had a AA credit rating. So let me pause here, and I would be happy to answer any questions. I would just want to finish by saying that we have looked very seriously at the islands that are part of the community that is represented here on this call, and we have reached some of the similar conclusions as Alberto in terms of the challenge of refinancing some of the debt that exists, partly because of its multilateral and bilateral nature, right? The Belize transaction worked, and other such transactions may work where you have a significant component of commercial debt that you can refinance at lower rates. When you already have multilateral debt typically is provided on concessionary terms, and the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and others don't permit discounting on their debt. In other words, you can't go to them and say, let me refinance your debt at a discount. That's not allowed by their charters. And so then you're left with bilateral debt. And I am very curious to hear, the opinions of the rest of the panelists, including the representative from China, because here is where the international community and the creditor nations can really step up to the plate and come up with programmatic approaches for doing these debt for climate transactions, where NGOs such as ours can again be an honest broker, developing conservation programs and reporting back to the creditor community the outcomes of our work. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much. So I think that was excellent discussion. We're running a little bit behind time, but I think both talks been so excellent. It's been well worth it. So now if I could just invite Eric to speak.
Thank you, Patrick. So I will try to be a little bit shorter to run on time. Yes, and because also Albert already mentioned a lot that we did during last few months related to that for climate swap. But from the beginning, I just wanted to give a very short information about the national conditions of Armenia, since I'm going to talk about the Armenian case of the for climate swap. So it's we already facing an impact of climate change. So in the end of the presentation, I just gave a few slides about the increase of temperature, that it's 1.3 degree already, reduction of precipitation, and natural hazards that it's going to up. And some information about our emissions. It's just the first slide for information. Then go to background and talk about that for climate swap. But what is interesting here, we're always missing some words about that for nature swap, that for climate swap, bonding, and the taxonomy is different. But the main difference that I may mention here is that that for nature swap, when it was started from the 80s with different countries, it was a result of reconstruction of debt. So the argument for starting this process was the debt and some problem of serving of debt, and big NGOs were playing an important role here. Debt for climate swap itself a little bit different, because it's some kind of innovative financial mechanism that allows debitor and creditor countries to talk with each other and to try. Sorry. Yeah, and can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, and to try to fulfill their obligations, because it's an obligation from both sides. One is a debt coming from a debtor country, another is a obligation taken by mostly creditor countries. It's an Annex II countries of the convention to support developing countries with the implementation of their NDCs. And if you will go through the NDCs that was presented to Secretariat, you will see that a lot of commitments coming from developing countries. It's conditional commitments, and to try to limit emissions, but from the creditor countries, mostly in developed countries, it's also to help to support implementation of climate adaptation and mitigation projects in developing countries. So we started to work on that for climate swap several years ago, and we tried to find the potential partners, and we looked for the 5 main creditors with an overall debt of $570 million that were France, Germany, Japan, US, and Russia. 4 of these countries are an Annex II countries, and they have a commitment to support, an obligation to support of implementation of NDC, and Russia with their technology transfer obligations. So we heard some success story behind this. Patrick, if I may ask just to switch the slides, because I'm already in the 5th page. So we had the case with Seychelles that initially was negotiated a bigger amount, but in the end it's become like a $21 million of swap. But here is very important point about the Paris Agreement, that countries of Paris Agreement, the parties of Paris Agreement, they have this obligation to support the implementation of NDC of countries. And this is an important point when we are starting to talk with the creditor countries about potential of debt for climate swap. So we started to talk with, just to bring a case with the France. So we suggested to talk about potential debt for climate swap with France on a sum of around $137 million. And the idea was to bring some investment on water sector that is one of the most vulnerable sectors in Armenia. So again, we try to find the ties where a proposed project will be in line with the country's NDC and their priorities, to be able to also give an argument for creditor countries to support the specific projects, and to be sure that we will be able to register these potential swap resources as a climate finance provided by creditor countries. This is a very important point, since it will give an additional incentives for creditor countries to talk, because again, initially debt for nature swap was about reconstruction of debt and some kind of a goodwill coming from creditor countries. And if it's not goodwill, we can choose another words, but it's also about the reconstruction of debt through the Paris Club and the quite complicated procedures. Here is just an alternative platform for two parties to discuss if one party can fulfill his obligations to creditor country, and when creditor country can fulfill their obligations under Paris Agreement. So this is a crucial point for debt for climate swap, that the swap financial resources may be registered as a climate finance provided by a creditor country. So again, it's an implementation of the NDCs. It's an important point here, as it will guarantee that the resources that will be allocated for implementation of the climate, mostly adaptation projects within a country, will be in line with the country's NDCs. And as Alberto already mentioned, this $100 billion annually commitment that was taken by the countries to assure that it will be available from 2020, it was failed. So we have several platforms like a Green Climate Fund or other institutions that the creditor and debitor countries can try to fulfill their commitments. But this may be also one of the additional platforms that two countries, besides going a complicated procedures through the debt forgiveness processes, the Paris Club, or negotiation with the broader players in the market, will start to talk and find solution for implementation of climate adaptation projects within a country. And now we are facing the problem with the climate finance. It's from one hand, developed countries and donors report challenges disbursing their funds to the failure of, the fundable projects. It's a procedural, a lot of problems there. And from other hand, many developing countries report difficulty accessing available resources due to lack of capacity and inability to fulfill specific requirements established by donors, climate funds, and financing institutions. Like the regular cycle for project proposal in the Green Climate Fund, it's around 36 months. And in some cases, it may even take longer. So this is, again, an alternative platform for both countries to fulfill their obligations. I bring also some benefits for debitor countries and for creditor countries, how it will impact, how it will have a multiplicative effect on their economy, since the resources that will be spent internally for climate adaptation and mitigation projects will create also positive socioeconomic impact on the countries and increase the resilience of the countries. And this is a very important for the Pacific region, since the region is facing, in line with the vulnerability on climate change, that this post-COVID difficulties and socioeconomic negative impacts here. So generally, these are the ideas. I may bring also some specific the practical arguments why creditor countries may be interested in the process, particularly if you may be able to include some corporates with from the creditor countries to be an implementer of potential projects, like we tried and we are going to do with the French companies, but probably we can discuss it with the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Eric. And next, if I can call Garth. Garth, you have the floor.
Yeah, kia ora, gents. What's my question? How can the Pacific Resilience Facility facilitate debt for climate swaps? And I'll sort of present within the context of three questions. First of all, what is the PRF? What challenges do Pacific Island countries face in engaging in debt for climate swap? And how can the PRF support debt for climate swaps? What is PRF? It's a Pacific-owned, led and designed initiative endorsed by Pacific Island Forum leaders. I chaired the technical working group on that, and our first efforts to put something together, we in fact designed a multilateral development bank. Once we did that, we realized we'd made a mistake. So what we had to do was find a particular niche that development partners in the region were not addressing at all in any form. So what we did find was that at the community level, most of the development partners didn't want to work. So we had a gap right across Pacific Island countries at the development level. And the other sort of missing aspect was, like there was no preparations for disaster. $1 spent now is $7 not having to spend post disaster. So the niche became a particular niche. It was a critical gap nobody else was supplying, and it would roll out community level projects across the Pacific Island countries at community level. The PIF is it exists in concept. It still has to. In fact, before COVID, early 2020, we were supposed to go on fundraise. We were looking at funding something like $1.5 billion US. We would have a sustainable fund, and we would roll out community level projects just using the interest earned. So that sort of sits there, wonderful concept with a particular niche. Question two, what challenges do Pacific Island countries face in engaging in debt for climate swaps? And I guess the first one really, at this current time, most Pacific Island countries require urgent debt relief to finance crisis recovery to minimize economic scarring. That's the conversation we're having now. If we don't get short-term debt relief, we're going to recovery is going to be prolonged. We're looking at something like 10 years of no growth. So debt for climate relief, based on my research, my reading, it takes quite a while to negotiate and establish. So we're looking at a sort of a medium-term debt relief instrument. 4 years to establish, negotiate, 4 years to establish. The second important point is most Pacific Island countries have limited familiarity with debt for climate swaps. You know, we're not familiar with it. So you're not going to find a comprehensive list of government officials who, in many cases, are busy with familiarity. So that would have to be something that would have to be capacity built into government institutions. Transaction costs tend to be high, and I can see that, although I haven't experienced it, because you've got multiple stakeholders. Planning, negotiation, and implementation is complex and time-consuming. I think there needs to be a clear benefit to Pacific Island countries to undertake this work, particularly for the small Pacific Island countries with small government agencies. And Alberto mentioned this in his presentation earlier. Debtors or debtor countries are required to make a long-term fiscal commitment to fund the agreed-upon projects, which can be challenging due to fiscal crisis or changes in political regime in many Pacific Island countries. I mean, that's a reality. As the governments will fund the, you've got a currency issue here, as governments will fund the agreed projects in local currency, there's a risk that inflation or currency devaluation can erode the real value of committed funding. And most of this stuff I'm pulling out of that, I thought a very excellent debt for climate swaps in the Pacific since that you guys published in March 2022. I found that quite informative. Most of the other stuff I was searching online was a bit too comprehensive. And again, the reference says the size of debt swaps have been in many cases too small to have a real impact in providing debt relief, which again raises the issue. Is this the best place to be dedicating limited resources, you know, from small Pacific Island countries, and to what extent will debt swaps provide relief amongst all the debt we have to address? Another challenge, debt for climate swaps require buy-in from debtor governments, creditors and third parties, as well as domestic stakeholders who need to agree to projects to be implemented. Achieving this is a complex and lengthy process. Another point that was, I think it was raised by Alberto as well, Alberto, I think was Slav, administrative standards need to be met. Okay, so if we look at what sort of administrative standards in public finance across the Pacific Island countries, you know, if we look at the PIPA assessments across Pacific Island countries, you get a pretty good indication of the capacity of some Pacific Island countries to actually raise the standards to meet the expectations of creditors and third parties. Another point that I picked up from Slavs, which I wasn't aware of, but I thought might be the case, and I think he mentioned you know, MDBs. In terms of MDB, you know, debt in the Pacific region, we've got a lot of World Bank, we've got a lot of ADB debt. I think ADB is one of the biggest creditors. You know, most debt across the region, I believe, is MDB debt. It's either World Bank or ADB. They don't discount. They don't allow discounting. I think so. It's almost like if most of our debt is held by ADB World Bank, then we've got a problem there, because if they don't allow discounting, then this becomes very difficult. I think Fiji is probably the exception. They have a lot of commercial, I think, domestic commercial debt. So moving forward, how can the PRF support debt for climate swaps? And I'll reiterate, I think the most important thing is the PRF is a regional arrangement with the Pacific Island countries working together, and it builds upon a lot of sort of regional working together arrangements that Pacific Island countries have, and I think we've been doing it since the early 1970s, in fact 1969. It remains a well-developed concept without funding or institution, with a focus upon community-level disaster preparedness. You know, it fills, at this point in time, it fills a unique niche. And I think the most important thing that can contribute to debt for climate swaps is this working together, you know, Pacific Island countries working together, because, and perhaps working together and make some sort of restructuring within the PRF itself. But Pacific Islanders working together could perhaps pool PIC debts of similar profiles. So you give a bigger profile. You would work with and attract receptive debtors, creditors on the basis of bigger bang for buck. You know, somebody might be interested if we have debt of a similar profile across a variety of Pacific Island countries, you know, the same creditors. and perhaps an interested third party that might be able to do some business there. So you create size. I think if Pacific Islanders countries work together, create something together, then it might create better influence by Pacific Islanders during negotiations to ensure that climate projects involved are based upon national priorities, NDC versus third-party priorities. Again, I'll say perhaps larger scale of debt more attractive to creditors and third parties, creating volume, creating impact. And I guess if we did work together in some sort of arrangement, a regional type arrangement, it reduces the administrative overhead, I guess, on Pacific Island countries, particularly the smaller ones. But then again, I guess it might be better to work for Pacific Island countries to work in a regional arrangements versus a bilateral. And it might be the case that if it was a bilateral, it's too small to attract creditors or third-party guys to get involved. Now, and I'll probably finish is, like regional approaches, regional arrangements are quite complex. A regional approach to debt for climate swap will increase the complexities by increasing the multitude of stakeholders. So you have more Pacific Island countries, more creditors. You'll have perhaps a variety of third-party intermediaries, as well as a multitude of domestic stakeholders in each PIC, Pacific Island country, impacted. So we would need to consider the cost of memberships of an arrangement of this nature with the benefits versus bilateral other means of reducing debt. And it's not unfamiliar to us. All our sort of regional arrangements are of this nature. Do we get the best benefit from regional, or do we get the best benefit from bilateral? So that's my voice on this. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Garth. Okay, and so we come to our last speaker, Dr. Wan Ting. Dr. Wan Ting, you have the floor. You're on mute.
Can you hear me? Can you
Yes,
hear me? Okay. Let me pull up my slides. Can you see my slides?
Not yet. Yes, we can now.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for inviting me here. I have learned a lot from the former speakers, and I agree with other speakers on the potential benefits for the debt for climate swaps and or more generally the debt for development swaps. As the last speaker, since I'm the last speaker, I want to spend more time discussing the potential challenges that may hinder this wonderful project, and invite more discussions and suggestions on how to encounter these challenges and make best use of the DDS. So there have been growing popularity in the idea of confronting debt and other sustainable development issues like climate change at once by using the instrument of debt for climate swaps or other development swaps. And we in China have received many suggestions on how China can participate and improve its performance in climate finance area and also in the debt restructuring, debt relief area. I think there are several reasons why the idea of debt for the climate swaps have gained so much attention. One reason is that existing debt resolution mechanism and the financing supports are seemed not enough. Like we already have the G20 debt service suspension initiative and also the common framework for debt treatment, which provides debt restructuring and debt relief support for poor country for 71 poor countries, and but these are not enough because other countries also experience problems in debt distress, and there are lack of private sector participation, and because that for climate swaps are known for its advantages of inviting private sector, because it was actually invented by the private sector, like NGOs. So they have strength in these areas comparing to existing plans like the G20 DSSI. And also we see there are a huge financing gap for sustainable development in developing countries. There are huge climate financing gap, especially in Pacific Islands countries. And also the other reasons why debt for climate swap gain popularity is that it is thought a way for developing countries to escape a vicious cycle of, because we have heavy debt burden, so we cannot invest enough in climate adaptation facilities, and therefore we suffer from more losses due to natural disasters and other events like energy transition. So if we go through the history of debt for climate swap or debt for development swap, we can see that in its early stage in the 1980s and 90s, it was invented by the private sector, by NGOs like the Conservation International, like the Nature Conservatory, and it witnessed its rapid development in the 1990s and 1920s. There are many Paris Club creditors are very interested in using these instruments, like the US. They have this Tropical Forest Conservation Act. But in the past 20 years, we have seen there are the pace of DDS, the usage and pace of DDS have been slowed. Because because of all the challenges mentioned by former speakers, and also because there are alternative debt restructuring and relief plans like the HIPCs and MDRIs. These debt relief plans, they have less strings attached and they are not earmarked. So these plans took the place of the debt for nature swap, and maybe not took the place, but they are more important as a source of debt relief for developing countries than debt for climate swap. And after the outburst of COVID-19, we have seen greater enthusiasm and in this debt for climate swap idea. However, we also see greater uncertainties. Let me jump a little bit because of the limitation of time. So if we look at the pros and cons for the debt for climate swap, we can make a very long list. But in general, we can come down to advantages of these kind of swap. Because the first advantage is that it can mobilize funds for sustainable development from more resources, including the private sector, including multilateral lenders and bilateral lenders. And these different lenders, different donors, they have complementary advantages. And by joining forces, they can generate a better outcome than they do these projects alone. Like Slav mentioned, that TNC, they are full of innovations. They are familiar with financial market. They come up with instruments that help the developing countries to enhance their credit and get financing from the international capital market with lower costs. And also we can see the local trust funds in Pacific. They have niches like Gas mentioned. They know how things go, how things are going in the community level, and they focus on the climate adaptation need. And maybe for official creditors and other like the multilateral bank like China, they have money, they have power, they can be an important source for scaling up these plans. However, we also seen there are two major problems with that for climate swaps. because there are because as Gus mentioned, it took about like 4 years of negotiation for average project. So the negotiation is prolonged, and there are possibilities of failure of coordination that just leads to the abortion of the project. So, and also I want to stress other challenges that comes up recently for DDS. The first challenge is that there have been dramatic changes in the international relations in macroeconomy after the Ukraine war. After the sanctions, with the sanctions on Russia, all the projects in Russia and by Russia are paused. And for multilateral banks, for official donors, for private sector, there are more geographical concerns when they give out money and when they design projects. And also there are a suit for security in all aspects, and these may lead to a trend of deglobalization. And the second great challenge is that in the next 2 years we have more problems. We have more problems in economic recoveries, and we will be encountering more financial risks for debtor countries. Due to the greater risk of urgent sentiment in the market and the tighter financial conditions due to the possibility that the Fed will raise interest rate in this year and in next year, and they will be facing less financing supply and higher financing cost in the past 2 years. It will be more difficult to issue bonds, and because we still have COVID-19, and actually I was quarantined to stay at home because we have small outbursts in Beijing in recent days, and with COVID still around, and with the vaccine lags behind in developing countries, the tourism suffers, and this is especially important for small islands countries in the Pacific. And also when things go bad, and when there is no money, and when there is pandemic, and when there is potential geographic conflicts, nobody can guarantee the economic and social stability of these countries. And for creditors, in the next 2 years, we will see more challenges in maintaining domestic growth and maintaining domestic financial stabilities. For China, it is very difficult for it to catch up with its 5.5% growth rate target for this year. And we have seminars and a lot of discussions on how we can achieve these targets and maintain the domestic economic growth. And for the U.S., with such high inflation, and the Fed is having a lot of trouble on when and how it should raise the interest rate. And for the EU as well, and more importantly, it suffers from the Ukraine and Russian war more directly than China and US. And so, and also all these changes may lead to change in the order of priorities. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic is the first priority. Everybody give money for supporting, for buying vaccine, for supporting people to fight pandemic. And maybe in the next years, when pandemic get better and we have the COP26 and people talk more about climate change, and we should give money for that. But how about this year and next 2 years? We may see debt crisis. We may see high food inflation, which lead to deeper poverty and more even conflicts. I don't know, and it will be very challenging next 2 years. And also for emerging creditors like China and also other official creditors as well, debt for nature swaps is a very difficult debt restructuring instrument to use. And also because there are all easier ways to provide debt restructuring and relief support, and there are easy ways to provide climate finance. Why we need to combine these two together and use a more complicated instruments? And I think this is the first question that creditor countries think about, because we have seen that in the past 20 years, the plans like MDRIs, the multilateral debt relief initiative, are more attractive for both creditors and debtors. So we must come up with answers for why debt for climate swaps can outwin them or become complement with these projects. And also, I think for creditors, because due to the challenges I mentioned in the next 2 years, there are a lot of coordination work to be done, both domestically and internationally. And for China in particular, we have this Belt and Road initiative, and we have spent a lot of money in the past 20 years. And we are urged by the international community to think about the problems, the potential problems in existing projects that we have already done. And like that transparency, like a white elephant, whether it is white elephant, whether it has damages to the local environment, and there are a lot of problems to solve. And with these problems, I think by solving these problems, we can see a better future. But also by these problems, we may see a slow momentum in the pace that China provide overseas supports to other countries. So I think that for nature swap has a lot of potentials. With joint efforts from different sources, it can generate a 1 + 1 more than 2 effect. But on the other hand, it may be just a disaster of coordination failure that leads to financial and reputation losses. So I think how can we guarantee, how can we increase the possibilities of success? I think the first is to provide more incentives. There must be reasons why the climate finance commitment of $100 billion did not come through yet, and we must think about these reasons and solve the concerns of developing countries and other creditors, emerging creditors as well. And also I think there are a lot of very promising progresses in the improvements in the execution model of DDS, like the more efficient coordination in implementation support from local agencies like the Pacific Resilience Facilities. And also there are a wider range of projects to be selected from and to attract creditor or donors' attention. And I must say the last key to success is just to leverage more resources and to perform good coordination. So thanks very much, and that would be my presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wenting. That was excellent. Okay, we've gone a little bit overboard, but over time. But I think it's been such a productive session. All of our speakers have really provided so much, and we'd like to thank them for their excellent presentations and valuable insights. And I can see many of the questions that have been raised have been active discussion within the chat box as well, and many answers given. So if you can just indulge us for a little bit longer, I think if we can just ask a couple of questions of our speakers, and then I'll shift back to Alberto for some closing remarks. So I'm just going to kick off just, Dr. Wenting, if I could just ask, one question to sort of kick it off. What do you think it would take for the Chinese government to agree to reduce its claims, debt claims, in exchange for climate and nature commitments?
Sorry, Sorry, let me make sure whether I get your problem or your question. You ask what are the potential obstacles for Chinese government to provide more financing for debt for climate swap? Is this the question?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I think several reasons. There are several reasons because we are experiencing more challenging years in the challenging years domestically. This is one reason, and the other reason is that we have to stop and think about the Belt and Road Initiative, because there are so many international criticism against China in the past few years, like that chap claim, like the White Elephant project, like the lack of transparency. There are, whether these criticisms are true or not, we have to think about them, right? As a creditor, if we want to do the projects better, we have to think about these criticisms and think about how whether we have done wrong or how we can improve. So these would be a very critical time for China to adjust its overseas plans. I must say that for climate swap, personally, I would very much vote for that for climate swap, because I have also written papers, suggestions to the public agencies and in the public to advocate this kind of brilliant idea for combining combining the two important problems together. And but I have to say that these projects are more complicated than just to provide debt restriction, simple debt relief for other creditor countries, and it is more complicated than asking the Chinese government to give out money for climate finance. So then, because if you just switch the purpose of the money, and the people will criticize for China for, like, you are not providing more money, you are just reallocating your fund. And these are the dilemmas China will be facing if it promised to be more involved in this climate for debt for climate swaps. And that will be my answer. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Again, I'm conscious of time, so maybe what I'd like to do is just sort of do a bit of a round table with each of our speakers, and just sort of ask, I guess, the question that because I think in terms of the questions that have been raised by in the chat box and across and earlier, many of those have been covered throughout the session. So I just thought what I'd do is touch on, if each of our speakers could perhaps sort of focus on what they think is the main or most significant constraint or risk for a potential climate debt swap in the Pacific. So maybe if I start with you, Slav, what would be your view as to what you think is the sort of most significant constraint that for implementing a debt for climate swap in the Pacific?
Thank you. I will give a two-pronged answer. So I would say that for the limited countries where there is significant pre-existing commercial debt, the most significant constraint is the availability of risk mitigation tools, such as the DFC political risk insurance, which we used in Belize. So we are in discussions with the Asian Development Bank, for example, to figure out a partial guarantee solution to basically de-risk the new money that would come in to refinance the pre-existing debt. Because after all, just like that homeowner in my example that's looking to refinance their house, it doesn't make sense to incur all the transaction costs of a refinancing if the new mortgage is more expensive or as expensive as the old. So you have to find longer and cheaper money than what the market is willing to do on its own devices, and the role of DFIs therefore is critical. For countries that don't have a lot of commercial debt, that have, for example, a lot of multilateral and bilateral debt, the major constraint is lack of basically political willingness on the part of creditors to engage in these discussions, often for good reasons. I mean, you heard you heard Dr. Ting, explain some of the concerns that the Chinese government, for example, has. And so therefore, it is important for the debtor nations and the creditor nations to sit in a good faith forum and discuss their mutual pinch points and figure out solutions for the common good. Because after all, both creditors, new creditors, traditional creditors, from the US to China, and the other nations, they want to do the right thing, right? They want an investment in climate mitigation and adaptation. But however, there is a lot of mistrust. There's a high level of mistrust. There's a high level also of confusion as to how to structure these deals and do so efficiently. But there's good precedent, and hopefully organizations such as mine can help bring these two parties together.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Slav. Okay, Eric, I guess just following on that question, what do you think is the most significant constraint or risk for a debt for climate swap in the Pacific?
I think it's a reputation issue is very important when you started to even open this discussion, because it's important not only for creditor but also for debtor country. As mentioned already, if you have the private debt, you have a different commercial debt. When you are starting to talk about the debt for climate swap, it's already harming if you are not using a correct wording for your discussions and negotiations. So this is a very important question that from the beginning, you should have a clear vision. What you want, what kind of project you want, where is your MRV system, how you will monitor everything, and to clearly mention what will be the benefit for creditor countries for this question. Because again, we had this discussion, we talk about that for nature swap, that for climate, for green bond, but the importance that there are two countries, a debtor and creditor, they have their own interests. They have their own obligations, and if you can find the platform to explain clearly how the both countries can benefit from this, because see, the Chinese case is a little bit different, but we have an Annex II countries under convention. They have an obligation. When we are talking about this $100 billion annually, everyone's saying, it's not clear, it's not a bold commitment, it will be loan or it will be grant, it's not clear yet, but it's somewhere there, and we will see that a lot of announcements coming from the creditor countries. They are doubling their pledges for green climate funds, spending hundreds of millions of dollars. If you are going to internally on the creditor countries, the legal structure, you see that there are some fundings there that will be allocated for different projects. But when you are going with the specific program and saying that this is our vulnerable sector, this is an adaptation that we need to take. We don't have money because we are spending this for this, activities now. Let's discuss. Let's talk. This should be then arguments coming from you and coming from them, and will be beneficiary for both sides. And here, this, the agents or the facilitators for this process may be involved, because there are some funds available also. You can apply through the Green Climate Fund readiness to support small countries to get some financial resources, to involve negotiators, the financial specialists, because specifically for small countries, they don't have the capacities. And for decades, these debt-related negotiations were mostly driven by creditor countries, and most of the capacity is there. And you should help also debtor countries to come with their arguments. So here is to bring your argument, and not only why it's important for you as a debtor countries, but why it may be an also beneficiary for creditor countries. If you can assure this, then process will start.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. Garth, so just putting it to you, what do you think is the biggest constraint or risk?
Well, I think I think a lot of what I'm going to highlight has already been highlighted by other speakers, but I guess the key one is sort of the influence and the sort of willingness of creditors to actually undertake debt swaps. I mean, most of our creditors are multilateral development banks. I mean, is this where we should be going? Because I'm not particularly interested in pursuing a course of debt swap if the key creditors are not interested. And I've already asked, can we get a clear indication from the likes of ADB whether they're going to engage on this? Because otherwise it's a waste of resources. Now, I do note the complexity, of putting in place these instruments. I've highlighted some of the capacity issues in many Pacific Island countries, particularly the small ones, and I see the previous speaker highlighted it as well. So, are we strong enough? Do we have the capacity to be to feel comfortable in a process of negotiation that takes place over a 4-year period? Are we comfortable that we're a partner here, or we own this process, that we're going to get the end result? I'm also a bit cautious about third-party intermediates. What's their agenda? Particularly if they were to be an NGO, what are their interests in our region? I guess to finalize, I guess it's the extent to which debt to climate swaps sort of address the debt relief that we need. Are there better ways to do this? Better, simpler ways. I note that Lowy recently came up with a figure of $3.5 billion required across the Pacific Island country region, the region. That if we need to roll that out over the next 3 years, otherwise we face 10 years of dormants. So, how can we, what extent would debt for climate relief be within the context of 3.5 billion? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Garth. And just Dr. Wen Ting, just for you, you've sort of explained it, but if you've got any more comments on what you think might be a constraint.
I think many of the viewpoints have been covered, and also concerns are addressed. Just an idea, if we are going to sit down together and discuss about how Chinese government, how work with the debtor government and work with other creditors, what would be the occasion and what would be the roles of the UN, the IMF, the World Bank? And this would be a question.
Excellent, thank you. Well, with that, I'll wrap up our questions and put it back to Alberto, because that's great timing. Alberto can speak for the UN. And just before I do, if I can ask everybody, before I wrap up, if I can ask everyone to fill in the evaluation form, which is available in the chat box. And now I'll put it back to Alberto for final observations and to close today's workshop, and just thank you for a truly fascinating discussion. Very sorry that we went over time, but I think it's been well worth it. It's been excellent. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. I also want to thank everybody. I think it was very, inspiring and very interesting workshop. I'm very pleased, about the presentations. I have to say I also learned quite a lot. And I think I would like to make a few closing points, but particularly I would like to start with what Wen Ting said, that about sitting down together, right? Because this is exactly what is going to happen in the regional debt conference organized by ESCAP and PIFs in the 5 to 8 April. So this is precisely an opportunity to, to get together creditors, debtors, development partners, and try to figure out, how to improve the situation of the Pacific small island developing states. So I would like to invite everybody to, to join this conference. They will have an opportunity to continue this conversation. I would like to make three comments regarding. Okay, I would like to clarify, Garth, about the point about the multilateral negotiations. I agree with you. This is not desirable. We don't want to have multilateral negotiation for debt swaps, because that will be incredibly complex and probably impossible to do. The negotiation has to be bilateral, has to be between an individual debtor and, the creditor, the creditors, but not more than one debtor because then it would become unmanageable, right? So when I mentioned the PRF, I didn't mention it as a forum to facilitate the negotiations, but as basically as an instrument that can provide services on financial management, on technical support, which are important elements for climate swaps. So that is what I'm thinking. It's about the technical and financial support, not about the negotiation process, because that has to be bilateral. And number two, I think you mentioned the question, Pat, about what is the most significant constraint. I would like to add something that was not said. I think that we need to change a little bit the mindset because, we have a lot of people, including myself before I started to do this research, have preconceptions about debt for climate swaps or, that they are complex, that they are not very, very useful because they, big overheads, and they are difficult to negotiate. And what I try to discuss, in the presentation and also in the paper, I hope, you can take a look later, is that this is a more flexible instrument that people understand, right? It is not necessarily, if you are a debtor and you have a multilateral development bank that is your main creditor, of course, the multilateral development bank is not going to engage directly with you in a debt for climate swaps, but you can involve a donor, maybe an Annex II country who has the obligation to commit, some amount of money for climate finance, and this debtor can, probably pay back part of your obligation with the multilateral development bank with the commitment that you as a debtor will implement some climate projects. So I think that there is room for a more flexible way of thinking about it, and I personally like a lot the Commonwealth recommendation or proposal, which is part of the paper. Number three, I want to mention something that Dr. Wanting also said. Is about the current financial situation globally. It is true we are in a upward for probably some complications. Even before the war in Ukraine, there was a high inflation in many countries. It is likely that the central banks are not going to continue being so accommodating, and that will increase the cost of servicing debt and will create a lot of problems in developing countries. So I think that it's likely that we are going to see more situations where debt restructurings are going to be necessary. And as I said before, okay, the debt for climate swaps are not a solution when you really need an urgent debt restructuring. Garth made that point very clearly for Cook Islands. However, I think that still is important for countries to think about, the implementation of their climate agenda, think about preparing, good pipelines of projects that are necessary, and then not to discard debt for climate swaps as a partial solution, to find this financing that is necessary. So I think, my final message is that it's important for people to take another look at debt for climate swaps, because there is a lot that can be done. And I think that we need to avoid all these misconceptions about the complexity, that it is too difficult, because the expertise is there. The Nature Conservancy is a good example. But beyond that, the market for the green bonds, for thematic bonds in general, is developing at a very fast pace. And with that, there is an improvement in the institutions that basically are supporting the implementation of these financial instruments. So what I'm trying to say is that there is a wealth of experience that is transferable. When it comes to green bond, for example, you need to have monitoring, reporting, and verification. You need to have a segregation of the funds. And this is basically the same that you need to do with the debt for climate swaps. So I think that we need to look at all these new developments, and I think that this instrument is probably less complicated and more feasible than people think. So with that, I would like to close the meeting. And again, thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoy it, and hopefully you will join us at the Pacific Debt Conference on 5th to 8th April. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Binaka. Bye-bye.
Thank you and all the best, Patrick, and thank you for facilitation.